Welcome back to the Carter Banks Hour. I read books that don't have audiobooks. This is chapter 29 of Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Right now, reading a chapter a night. Usually takes me about an hour to read a chapter, hence the name of the Carter Banks Hour. So yeah, let's do it. Chapter 29. Hard Words, Soft Words. The first thing Yuri did after returning from his official trip was to visit his father and spend 2 hours with him. Before Yuri set off, Pavel Nikolaevich telephoned him and asked him to bring his warm shoes, overcoat, and hat. He was sick and tired of this vile ward. The blockheads that inhabited its beds and their idiotic conversations, the hospital lobby he found no less repulsive. Although he was very weak, he had a longing to go out into the fresh air. So this is what they did. They wrapped a scarf lightly round his tumor, which he could still feel when he moved his head, but much less than before. He was unlikely to run into anyone he knew in the paths of the medical center grounds. Even if he did, they would never recognize him in these motley clothes. So Pavel Nikolaevich felt no embarrassment or uneasiness as he strolled along. Yuri took his arm, and Pavel Nikolaevich leaned on him heavily. He enjoyed taking step after step across the clean, dry asphalt, particularly as it presaged a speedy return first to his beautiful apartment, where he would rest, and later to the work and activity he enjoyed so keenly. It was not only the treatment that had worn Pavel Nikolaevich down, but the dull inactivity. He was no longer a vital cog in a large, important mechanism. In fact, he had felt he had lost all power and significance. He wanted to get back as soon as possible to the place he was loved, and where people couldn't do without him. During the week, there had been some cold and rainy spells, but today, the warm weather had begun to reassert itself. It was still cool in the shade of the buildings, and the earth was damp. But it was so warm in the sun that Pavel Nikolaevich could scarcely bear even the weight of the autumn coat he was wearing. He began to undo it button by button. It was a especially good opportunity for him to have a sober, serious talk with his son. Today, Saturday, was considered the last day of Yuri's official trip. Yuri was in no hurry to get to work, which was all the more reason for Pavel Nikolaevich to take his time, too. His son's affairs had taken a turn which might become dangerous. His paternal heart had realized this. He acknowledged that he had neglected them. Clearly, his son had not returned from his assignment with a clear conscience. He kept averting his gaze instead of looking his father in the eye. As a child, Yuri had been quite different. A straightforward boy. He had only developed this shy, evasive manner toward his father during his years as a student. It irritated Pavel Nikolaevich tremendously, and sometimes he would shout at him, "Hey, you! Hold your head up straight!" But today he decided he would refrain from such sharpness. He would speak to him tactfully. He asked Yuri to describe in detail how he had acquitted and distinguished himself as a representative of the Republic's legal inspection team in the remote towns it had been his duty to visit. Yuri began to tell him, but without much enthusiasm. He related one case, then another, but he kept turning his eyes aside. "Come on, tell me more, tell me more." They sat down in the sun for a while on a bench, which had dried off. Yuri was wearing a leather jacket and a warm woolen cap. He looked serious and manly enough, but there was that streak of weakness inside him, which was ruining him. "Yes, well, there was a case involving a truck driver," he said, staring at the ground. "What about the truck driver?" It was winter, and he was driving a truckload of cooperative foodstuffs. He was supposed to drive 70 kilometers, but he was stopped halfway by a snowstorm. Everything was covered in snow, and the wheels wouldn't grip. It was freezing cold, and not a soul in sight. The snowstorm whirled round him for more than 24 hours. He couldn't stand it any longer in the cab, so he abandoned the truck as it was, with a full load, and went to find somewhere to spend the night. The next morning the storm had died down, and he came back with a tractor to pull the truck out, but there was one case of macaroni missing. What about the delivery man? As it happened, he was doubling up for him. He was on his own. Disgraceful negligence! Yes, of course. So he grabbed his chance and made a quick profit. Father, it was too high a price to pay for a case of macaroni, said Yuri, and he raised his eye at last. A stubborn, unpleasant expression had appeared on his face. It got him 5 years, that case of macaroni. There was a case of vodka in the truck, too. They weren't touched. You shouldn't be so gullible, Yuri, so naive. Who else could have taken it during the snowstorm? Someone might have come along on a horse, who knows? There'd be no tracks left by the morning. Well, even supposing he didn't take it himself, he did leave his post, didn't he? What sort of behavior is that? Abandoning state property and just walking away? Guilt was beyond doubt. The sentence was so transparently correct. Perhaps even a little on the lenient side. But what infuriated Pavel Nikolaevich was that his son didn't see it that way. He had to ram the point down his throat. Yuri was weak and flabby in most things, but when it came to arguing some stupid point, he was as stubborn as a mule. Try to imagine, Father, a snowstorm, 10 degrees below. How could he spend the night in the cab? He'd have died, wouldn't he? What do you mean, died? Died? What about sentries in the army? Sentries are relieved every 2 hours. Well, what if a sentry isn't relieved? What about at the front? It doesn't matter about the weather. Sentries just have to stand there. Die if necessary. But abandon their post? Never. Pavel Nikolaevich even pointed a finger to show where they stood and died, rather than desert. Think what you're saying. If this one gets off, all the truck drivers will start abandoning their posts. They'll pinch things till there's nothing left of the state. Don't you understand? No, Yuri didn't understand. It was apparent from his dunce-like silence that he didn't understand. All right, I know you have these childish opinions. It's because you're young. You may even have mentioned them to someone else, but I hope at least you had the sense not to put your views down in the official report. Yuri's chapped lips moved, then moved again. I made out an official objection. I suspended execution of the sentence. You suspended it? And now they're going to review it? Oh, no! No! Pavel Nikolaevich covered his face, half hiding it with his hands. It was just what he dreaded. Yuri was making a mess of his job, ruining himself, and casting a shadow over his father's reputation. Pavel Nikolaevich felt positively sick with fury. The helpless fury of a father who knows he can never pass his own intelligence or efficiency on to a lout of a son. He got up, and Yuri rose as well. They started walking, and once again Yuri tried to support his father by the elbow. Pavel Nikolaevich knew that even if he used both hands, he would never be able to beat into his son's head any understanding of the blunder he had committed. He began by explaining to him about the law, about legal observance, about the unshakable foundation on which it was based. A foundation not lightly to be questioned, especially if one was considering working as a legal inspector in a state prosecutor's office. All truth was specific. The law is the law. But one should also take into account the specific movement and his specific situation, the course of action required at any given time. He particularly tried to make Yuri understand the organic interrelationships of all branches of the state's machinery. Consequently, it would be wrong for him to assume an attitude of arrogance, even when arriving in an out-of-the-way corner of the world with the mandate from the Republic's authorities. On the contrary, he should be sensitive to the local context and try not to cross the paths of local officials who knew the situation and its requirements better than he did. If they gave the truck driver 5 years, it meant that this must be the sentence deemed necessary in this particular area. And so they walked into the shadow of the buildings and out of it, along the pathways, straight and crooked, and beside the river. Yuri listened, but all he said was, "Aren't you getting tired, Father? Perhaps we should sit down again." He was a pig-headed boy, and no mistake. The whole business had not taught him a thing. All he had retained were those 10 degrees of frost in the driver's cab. Pavel Nikolaevich was naturally getting tired, and it was dreadfully hot in his overcoat. He sat down again on a bench among some thick bushes. They weren't in leaf yet, just twigs. You could see right through them. But the first tiny, ear-shaped leaves were beginning to twist themselves out of their buds. The sun was very warm. Pavel Nikolaevich was not wearing his spectacles on the walk. His face was relaxing, and his eyes were resting. He screwed up his eyes as he sat there silently in the sunlight. Not far away, below the steep bank, the river was roaring along like a mountain stream. Pavel Nikolaevich listened to it, warmed himself, and thought how pleasant it was to be getting back to life. He knew for sure he'd still be alive while all this was turning green, the next spring as well. But he had to complete the picture of Yuri's situation. He had to pull himself together and restrain his anger. Otherwise, he would frighten him off. He sighed and then asked his son to carry on and tell him about a few more cases. However slow he was on the uptake, Yuri knew perfectly well what would provoke his father's praise or abuse. The next case he described, Pavel Nikolaevich could not but approve. All the same, Yuri kept averting his eyes. He hadn't learned to lie, and his father sensed there was yet another bad case in store for him. "Tell me everything," he said. "I want to know everything. You know, all I want to do is give you the sensible, reasonable advice. I'm only doing it for your own good, you know. I don't like to see you make mistakes." Yuri sighed and told his story. In the course of his inspection, he had to go through a good many old court records and documents, some of them as much as 5 years old. He had begun to notice that some of the 1 ruble or 3 ruble duty stamps were missing from the documents, or, to be more exact, traces of them remained, but the stamps themselves were gone. Where had they got to? Yuri thought. Yuri thought it over and began to dig around. He discovered that some of the stamps stuck on recent documents looked defective and slightly torn in places. He then guessed that one of the girls who had access to the court archives, Katya or Nina, must be pasting on old stamps instead of new stamps and pocketing the client's money. "Think of that," said Pavel Nikolaevich. He grunted and threw up his hands. "Just think of all the loopholes there are for stealing from the state. You wouldn't think of that one straight off, would you?" Yuri had conducted his investigation quietly, without breathing a word to anyone. He made up his mind to get to the bottom of it, to find out which of the 2 girls was the embezzler. He formed a plan. He made dates with them both, first Katya, then Nina. He would take each girl to the cinema, and then to her home. The one who had expensive furniture and carpets would be the thief. "Well done," said Pavel Nikolaevich, clapping his hands and smiling. "Very clever. Combining business with pleasure, you might say. Good boy." But Yuri had discovered that neither girl seemed to have much to spare. One lived with her parents, the other with her younger sister. They didn't even have money of the things Yuri regarded as necessities, let alone carpets. It made him wonder how they lived at all. He thought it over, then went and told the story to the judge they worked for. He asked the judge not to bring the matter to a court of law, simply to reprimand the girls and have done with it. The judge was very grateful to Yuri for preferring the matter to be handled privately. The publicity would have harmed him too. They called both girls in separately and scolded them angrily for several hours. First one confessed, then the other. Both had been making hundreds of rubles a month out of the business. "Oh dear, it should have been done officially. It really should," said Pavel Nikolaevich. He was as distressed as though he had missed the chance himself. But then on the other hand, it was right not to have embarrassed the judge. Yuri had been very tactful in that respect. At least they should have been made to pay back what they took, he said. Yuri could hardly bring himself to mention how the story ended. He simply couldn't grasp the meaning of what had happened. When he had gone to the judge and suggested dealing with the matter privately, he had been conscious of acting with great magnanimity. He was so proud of his decision. He imagined the joy every girl would feel after the honor of being made to confess. They would be expecting punishment, then suddenly they would be offered forgiveness. He would vie with the judge in telling them how shamefully they had behaved. He would cite examples from his own 23 years of experience of honest men who had every opportunity to steal but who didn't. Yuri lashed the girls with hard words, knowing the effect would be softened by forgiveness afterwards. The girls were forgiven, and they had left. But in the days that followed, they did not beam with delight every time they met Yuri. Not only did they not come up and thank him for his noble act, they even did their best to ignore him. He was astounded. He simply couldn't understand it. Perhaps they didn't realize what they had been spared. But no, working in a lawyer's office, they must have known perfectly well. Unable to restrain himself, he went up to Nina and asked her, point blank, whether she was happy about the way things had gone. "Why should I be happy?" Nina replied. "I'll have to change my job now. I'll never live on my wages alone." Then he asked Katya, who was the prettier of the two, to come to the cinema with him again. Katya replied, "No. I like to be honest when I go out with men. I can't do it the way you do." So this was the puzzle he had brought back from his assignment, and it still exercised his mind. He had been deeply hurt by the girl's ingratitude. He knew life was more complicated than it seemed to his father, who was straightforward and had a one-track mind, but apparently life was even more complicated still. What should Yuri have done? Refused to spare them? Or said nothing and overlooked the fact that the stamps were being reused? But in that case, was there any point in his work at all? His father asked no more questions, and Yuri was only too pleased to hold his tongue. In Pavel Nikolaevich's eyes, it was just another disaster brought about by his son's clumsy touch. He was finally convinced that if one doesn't develop a backbone as a child, one never will. It was hard being angry with one's own son, but he was very annoyed and very upset for him. They had probably stayed too long outside. Pavel Nikolaevich's feet began to feel cold, and he had a terrible urge to lie down. He let Yuri kiss him, then sent him on his way back to the ward. A lively discussion was going on there in which everyone had joined, except the main speaker had no voice. It was the imposing-looking philosopher, that assistant professor who used to visit them in the ward. He had since undergone an operation on his larynx. A few days before, he'd been transferred from the surgical to the X-ray ward on the second floor. A metal gadget, like a toggle from a young pioneer's scarf, had been inserted conspicuously into the front of his throat. The professor was an educated, likable man, and Pavel Nikolaevich made every effort not to hurt his feelings, not to wince visibly at the clasp in his larynx. Every time he spoke, the philosopher placed one finger on it. It made his voice at least semi-audible. He was fond of speaking, indeed, accustomed to it, and now, after the operation, was delighted to make use of the ability, which had been restored to him. He was standing in the middle of the ward telling a story. His voice was hollow, but louder than a whisper. "The amount of stuff he's got piled up," he was saying. You can't imagine. In one room there's a suite of furniture made of pale gilded wood, with backs, seats and arms upholstered in lilac velvet plush. He thinks he's a serious collector. He's got 4 armchairs like that, and a small sofa. Where did he pinch them from? I'd like to know. From the Louvre, I suppose. The philosopher laughed. He was greatly amused. In the same room, he's got another set with hard seats and high black backs. The piano he brought from Vienna. He has a table inlaid with ivory. It's like something out of Goethe's Weimar. And yet, he covers it with a blue gold tablecloth that hangs down to the floor. On another table, he's got a bronze statue, a curvaceous, naked girl with a ring of torches in her hand. But the lamps don't work. The statue's too large for the room. It almost reaches the ceiling. It was probably meant for a park. Then he's got clocks, wall clocks, watches, grandfathers, some coffee table sized, some as high as the ceiling. Most of them don't go. There's a huge bowl that came from a museum with one single orange in it. I only went into 2 rooms, but I counted 5 mirrors, some in carved oak frames, some with marble stands. Then there were pictures, seascapes, views of mountains, views of Italian streets. The philosopher was laughing. Where does he get it all from? Wondered Solzhenitsyn, both hands as usual, propping the small of his back. Some of it's war booty. Some of it he bought in second-hand shops. He met a girl who worked in one of them. Originally, he came in to ask her to value some of his furniture, but he ended up marrying her. After that, they joined forces, and everything valuable that came along they reserved for themselves. But where does he work himself? Imogen insisted. Nowhere. He got his pension when he was 42. But he's still a great ox of a man. He'd be a good fellow for cutting down trees. He has a stepdaughter and granddaughter living with him. And you should see the way he talks to them. I order you, he says. I'm in charge here. This is my house. I built it. He sticks his hands under the lapels of his overcoat and walks about the house like a field marshal. His name's Yemelyan, according to his passport, but for some reason he makes everyone at home call him Shashik. But can one say he's happy with his lot? No, he's not. What gets him on the raw is that the general commanding the army he was in has a house in Kislavosk, with 10 rooms, 2 cars, and even his own man to stoke the boiler. Shashik hasn't got as far as that. They laughed. There's an asterisk next to Kislavosk. It says, a fashionable resort in the northern Caucasus. Sounds familiar, I gotta say. Kislavosk. Kislavosk. It's fun to say. It's fun to say, I will say. Pavel Nikolaevich found the story out of place and thoroughly unassuming. Shlubin didn't laugh either. He looked at the others as if he wished they'd let him get some sleep. All right, maybe it's funny, said Kostoglotov, from his prostrate position. But how is that there was a feature in the local paper? When was it? A few days ago. Someone in the ward remembered. It was about a man who had built himself a villa with government funds. Then it all came out, and you know what happened. He confessed he'd made a mistake, handed the place over to the children's home, and all he got was an official reprimand. He wasn't even expelled from the party. Yes, that's right. Solzhenitsyn remembered the case as well. Why only a reprimand? Why wasn't he put on trial? The philosopher hadn't read the article, and was not ready to undertake to explain why the man hadn't been tried. It was left to Rusanov. Comrades, he said, if he repented, realized his error, and turned the place over to the children's home, why take extreme measures? We must be humane. It's a fundamental feature of our... All right, maybe it's funny, Kostoglotov continued in his drawl, but how do you explain it all? From the philosophical point of view. I mean, Shashik and the villa. The professor made a spreading gesture with one hand. The other he held to his larynx. Unfortunately, he said, these are survivals of bourgeois mentality. Why bourgeois? Gumbled Kostoglotov. Why? What else do you think it is? Said Vadim, switching on his attention. He was in the mood for reading, but now obviously the whole ward was about to be embroiled in a brawl. Kostoglotov raised himself from his prone position, hauling himself up to the pillow to get a better view of Vadim. Now the others. What else? Why, it's human greed. That's what it is. Not bourgeois mentality. There were greedy people before the bourgeoisie, and there will be greedy people after the bourgeoisie. Rusanov was not yet lying down. He surveyed Kostoglotov across his bed and declared didactically, if you dig deep into such cases, you'll always find a bourgeois social origin. Uh-oh. I think I know where Solzhenitsyn's going with this, but I'm not going to say what I think. Rusanov was not yet lying down. He surveyed Kostoglotov across his bed and declared didactically, if you dig deep enough into such cases, you'll always find a bourgeois social origin. Kostoglotov jerked his head as if he was spitting. That's a lot of nonsense. All that about social origin. What do you mean, nonsense? There was a stabbing pain in Rusanov's side, and he clutched it. He had never expected a brazen assault like this, even from Bone Chewer. Yes, what do you mean, nonsense? Asked Vadim, lifting his dark eyebrows in puzzlement. I mean what I say, growled Kostoglotov. He hauled himself up a bit further so that he was now sitting upright. It's a lot of nonsense that's been stuffed into your head. What do you mean, stuffed? Are you responsible for what you're saying? Rusanov brought the words out shrilly, his strength unexpectedly returning. Whose heads have been stuffed? Asked Vadim, straightening his back, but keeping his book balanced on one leg. Yours! We aren't robots, said Vadim, shaking his head. Why don't you take anything on trust? Who do you mean by we? Kostoglotov scowled. His forelock was hanging over his face. I mean us. Our generation. Well, why'd you swallow all this talk about social origin, then? That's not Marxism, it's racism. What did you say? Shouted Rusanov, almost roaring with pain. Exactly what you heard, Kostoglotov threw the reply back at him. Listen to this, shouted Rusanov, staggering and weaving his arm as if calling everyone in the ward to gather round him. I call you as witnesses. This is ideological sabotage. Quickly, Rusanov lowered his legs off the bed. Swinging both elbows, he made a highly indecent gesture at Rusanov, at the same time exploding with one of the filthiest words written up on the walls. Going! There's a large M dash that reaches it's like 6 M dashes. It's probably fuck. Probably go and fuck yourself. But I'm going to say, beep. Maybe I'll even put a beep in here. You and your ideological sabotage. A fine habitat you've developed. You mother... Every time someone disagrees with you, you call it ideological sabotage. Hurt and insulted by this impudent hoodlum, with his obscene gesture and foul language, Rusanov choked, making an attempt to straighten his slipping spectacles. Now Kostoglotov was yelling so loudly, his words could be heard by the whole ward, even in the corridor. Zoya looked in round the door. Why do you keep cackling on about social origins like a witch doctor? You know what they used to say in the 20s. Show us your calluses. Why are your hands so white and puffy? Now that was Marxism. I've been a worker, I've worked, cried Rusanov. But he could hardly see his assailant since he couldn't get his spectacles on right. I believe you, Kostoglotov bellowed unpleasantly. I believe you. You even started to lift a log during Saturday work. There's an asterisk next to that. Voluntary unpaid manual labor was a feature of communist education and applied to everyone, including some white-collar officials. So I guess community service? I believe you, Kostoglotov. bellowed unpleasantly. I believe you. You even started to lift a log during Saturday work. Only you stopped halfway. Okay, so I'm guessing he's basically, when he's like, I worked, it's like, oh, yeah, you probably did like the voluntary, community service that white-collar people did, but you didn't even do that because you stopped halfway. I believe you, Kostoglotov bellowed unpleasantly. I believe you. You even started to lift a log during Saturday work, only you stopped halfway. All right, maybe I am the son of a merchant, third class, but I've sweated blood all my life. Here, look at my calluses on my hands. So what am I? Am I bourgeois? Did my father give me a different sort of red or white corpuscle in my blood? That's why I tell you yours isn't a class attitude, but a racial one. You're a racist. What? What am I? You're a racist, Kostoglotov spelled the word out for him. All right, this is so good I have to read this again. I'm enjoying this, considering it's 2020 and everyone's a racist, but it's interesting to see how this is like also, this applies to Kostoglotov. All right, maybe I am the son of a merchant, third class, but I've sweated blood all my life. Here, look at my calluses on my hands. So what am I? Am I bourgeois? Did my father give me a different sort of red or white corpuscles in my blood? That's why I tell you, yours isn't a class attitude, but a racial attitude. You're a racist. What? What am I? You're a racist. Kostoglotov spelled the word out for him, leaping to his feet and drawing himself up to his full height. The thin voice of the unjustly insulted Rusanov had reached a shriek. Vadim was also speaking rapidly and indignantly, but he didn't get up from his bed, and no one caught what he was saying. The philosopher was reproachfully shaking his big, well-shaped head with its cap of well-groomed hair. But who could hear his diseased voice? The philosopher now came up close to Kostoglotov, waited for him to draw a breath, and just had time to whisper to him, Have you heard of the expression, a hereditary proletarian? It makes no difference if you had 10 proletarian grandfathers. If you're not a worker yourself, you're no proletarian, boomed Kostoglotov. He's not a proletarian, he's a son of a bitch. The only thing he's after is a special pension. I heard him say so himself. He saw Rusanov opening his mouth, so he decided to give it to him, straight in the guts. You don't love your country. You love your pension. And the earlier you get it, the better. Why not when you're 45? And here I am, wounded at Voronezh, and all I've got is a pair of patched boots and a hole in a donut. But I love my country. I'm not getting a kopeck in sick benefits for these 2 months, but I still love my country. He waved his long arms until they nearly reached Rusanov. Suddenly furious, he threw himself raging into debate, just as he had done dozens of times in prison. His mind overflowed with phrases and arguments he'd heard from other men who were probably no longer alive. In the heat of the fray, the scene seemed to shift in his mind. The crowded enclosed room, crammed with beds and people, became a prison cell, which made it easier for him to use obscene language, and if it came to a fight, he was ready for that too. Kostoglotov was now in such a state that he might easily have punched Rusanov in the face. Rusanov, sensing this, cringed away and fell silent under the fury of the assault. But his eyes burned with rage. I don't need any pension, shouted Kostoglotov, finishing what he had to say. I haven't got a bean, and I'm proud of it. I'm not trying to get anything. I don't want a huge salary. I despise such things. Shh, hissed the philosopher, trying to stop him. Socialism provides for the differentiation in the wage structure. To hell with your differentiation, Kostoglotov raged, as pig-headed as ever. You think that while we're working towards communism, the privileges some have over others ought to be increased, do you? You mean that to become equal, we must first become unequal, is that right? You call that dialectics, do you? He was shouting, but his shouts echoed painfully above his stomach. His voice was shaken with pain. Several times Vadim tried to intervene, but Kostoglotov managed to draw on a hidden reserve. He threw more and more arguments into the field, like balls in a bowling game, and Vadim had no time to dodge them all. "Oleg!" Vadim cried, trying to stop him. "Oleg, it's the easiest thing in the world to criticize a society which is still establishing itself, but you must remember it's only 40 years old. It's not yet 40. "I'm no older than that," Kostoglotov retorted insistently. "I'll always be younger than this society. What do you expect me to do? To keep silent all my life?" Again the philosopher tried to check him with a gesture of his hand, beseeching him to have mercy on his stricken larynx. He whispered a few reasonable sentences about people making different contributions to the national product and the need to distinguish between those who washed hospital floors and the men in charge of the health service. Kostoglotov was about to roar something incoherent in reply when suddenly Shlubin, whom everyone had forgotten, began to move in on them from his far corner by the door. He hobbled toward them awkwardly, looking as slovenly and disheveled as ever, his dressing gown in such disorder that he looked like a man roused from sleep in the middle of the night. They all saw him and looked at him in surprise. He stood in front of the philosopher, raised a finger, and waited till the room was silent. "Are you familiar with the April Theses?" There is an asterisk next to the April Theses. The asterisk says the revolutionary program expounded by Lenin in April 1917 after his return to Russia from Switzerland. "Are you familiar with the April Theses?" he asked. "Why, aren't we all?" The philosopher smiled. "Can you list them point by point?" continued Shlubin, interrogating him in his guttural voice. "My dear sir, there's no need to go through them one by one. The April Theses discussed the methods of transition from the bourgeois democratic revolution to the socialist revolution. In this sense, there's one point I remember," said Shlubin, moving the bushy brows above his unhealthy, tired, tobacco-colored, bloodshot eyes. "It runs, no official should receive a salary higher than the average pay of a good worker. That's what they began the revolution with." "Is that so?" said the professor, in surprise. "I don't remember that." "Go home and check it. The regional health service director shouldn't get any more than Nelia here." He wagged his finger reprovingly in front of the philosopher's face, then limped back to his corner. "Aha, you see," said Kostoglotov. He enjoyed this unexpected support. It was just the sort of argument he'd been in need of, and the old man had rescued him. "Put that in your pipe and smoke it." The philosopher straightened the toggle on his larynx. He couldn't think of anything to say. "You don't think Nelia's a good worker, do you?" he brought out finally. "All right, then, what about the orderly who wears glasses? They all get the same pay." Rusanov was just sitting there. He had turned his back on the whole thing. He couldn't bear the sight of Kostoglotov any more. He was shaking with disgust, but Kostoglotov's long arms and fists meant he could not take administrative action. As for the repulsive owl from the corner, he had been right to take an immediate dislike to him. Imagine paying the health service director and the floor scrubber the same rate. Couldn't he think of anything cleverer than that? There was absolutely nothing to be said. Suddenly the whole debate fell apart, and Kostoglotov found no one to go on arguing with. Anyway, he had already shouted everything he had wanted to say. Besides, shouting made him feel sore inside. It was now painful for him to speak. At that point, Vadim, who hadn't got up from his bed throughout the debate, beckoned Kostoglotov over to him. He asked him to sit down and began to explain quietly. "You used the wrong scale of values, Oleg. Your mistake is comparing the present day with the ideal of the future. You should rather compare it with the festering sores that plagued Russia's history before 1917. I wasn't alive then. I don't know," Kostoglotov yawned. "You don't have to have lived then. You can find out easily enough. Read Saltykov Shendrin." It's an asterisk next to Saltykov Shendrin. Says, the best-known Russian satirist of the 19th century, aka 1826 to 1889. That's a huge compliment to get called that by arguably the best-known Russian satirist I know. He's the only textbook you need. Or compare us with these showcase Western democracies, where a man can never get his rights or justice, or even lead a normal human life. Kostoglotov yawned once more, wearily. The anger that had flared and thrown him into argument had subsided. The exercise of his lungs made his stomach, or his tumor, very sore. He mustn't talk so loudly. Were you in the army, Vadim? No, I wasn't. Why? Why weren't you? We were doing an officer's training course at university. Oh, I see. I was in for 7 years as a sergeant. It was called the Workers' and Peasants' Army then. The section commander made 20 rubles a month, but the platoon commander made 600. And at the front, they gave the officers special rations, cookies and butter and tinned food. They hid somewhere where we other ranks couldn't see them and ate the stuff there. Do you see? They did it because they were ashamed. And we had to build the officers' shelters before we built our own. I was a sergeant. I told you that, didn't I? Vadim frowned. He didn't know about all this. But of course, there must be some reasonable explanation for it. Why are you telling me this? Because I want to know where the bourgeois mentality comes in. Who's got the bourgeois mentality? Oleg had already said more than enough today, even without this remark. He felt a bitter relief that there was now very little for him to lose. He yawned loudly again and walked back to his bed. He gave another yawn and another. Was it weariness or illness that gave him this urge to yawn? Or was it because these arguments, counter-arguments, technical terms, bitter, angry glances suddenly seemed so much squelching in a swamp? None of this was to be compared with the disease that afflicted them or with death which loomed before them. He yearned for the touch of something different, something pure and unshakable. But where he would find that, Oleg had no idea. This morning he'd received a letter from the Cadmans. Among other things, Nikolai Ivanovich had answered his question about the origin of the expression, "soft words will break your bones." It came from a collection of didactic 15th century Russian chronicles, a sort of manuscript book. In it, there was a story about Kotovras. Nikolai Ivanovich always knew about things that were old. Kotovras lived in a remote desert. He could only walk in a straight line. King Solomon summoned him, and by a trick contrived to bind him with a chain. Then they took him away to break stones. But since Kotovras could only walk in a straight line, when they led him through Jerusalem, they had to tear down the houses which happened to be in his way. One of them belonged to a widow. The widow began to weep and implore Kotovras not to break down her poor, pitiful dwelling. Her tears moved him, and he gave in. Kotovras began to twist and turn to left and right until he broke a rib. The house remained intact, but Kotovras said, "Soft words will break your bones. Hard words will rouse your anger." Oleg thought it was over. We must be raging wolves compared to Kotovras and those 15th century scribes. Who today would let himself break a rib for the sake of a few soft words? The Cadman's letter hadn't begun with the story, though. Oleg groped for it on his bedside table and found it. They had written, "Dear Oleg, we are in great distress. Beetle has been killed. The village council hired 2 hunters to roam the streets and shoot the dogs. They were walking down the streets shooting. We hid Tobik, but Beetle broke loose, went out and barked at them. He'd always been frightened even when you pointed a camera lens at him. He had a premonition. They shot him in the eye. He fell down beside an irrigation ditch, his head dangling over the edge. When we came up to him, he was still twitching. Such a big body, and it was twitching. It was terrifying to watch. You know, the house seems empty now. We feel guilty about Beetle for not keeping him in, for not hiding him. We buried him in the corner near the summer house. Oleg lay there imagining Beetle, but he didn't picture him shot to death with one bleeding eye, his head dangling into an irrigation ditch. He saw two paws and a great, kind, affectionate head with bear-like ears hanging like drapes over the tiny window of Oleg's hut, just as he was when he came to see him and wanted him to open the door. So now they had killed the dog as well. Why? That's the end of chapter 29. Oh, man. This is getting crazy. We are almost finished with this book, so if you have any suggestions of what I should read next, let me know on Twitter at Carter Banks. Subscribe on YouTube if you haven't, at Carter Banks. Follow the Instagram at Carter Banks 4L, as in for life. Thank you all for tuning in, and stay safe. Peace.